Ah, women. Women, 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 women. For you young fellows fresh on the cusp of a blooming manhood, the questions abound. What are women like? What do women want? How should I treat a woman? Perhaps the thorniest problem facing any young man is finding a woman in the first place. It turns out to be nearly impossible. This reporter spent countless hours searching for a woman, like these pictured here, to no avail. The nearest we came during a tense stakeout was this fellow, who experts believe is not a woman. We begin to wonder, where are all the women? The overheated references in poetry, the images that dominate our media. Is it all an elaborate fraud? This grainy photograph is the only direct evidence we have of a woman in her natural environment. The longer hair, the gentle and nurturing demeanor are typical of how witnesses describe their supposed encounters with women. This footprint, while possibly the work of jokesters, is another piece of the puzzle, and it is hard to discount this man's terrifying story.
And then, this woman, well, I think it was a woman, she, married me.
Did you have any children, sir?
I don't remember.
Someday, perhaps, an actual woman will emerge, and they will no longer exist only in the realm of myth and maybe. Thank you.
Before I begin this commentary, I think I should explain what series of mistakes I made that led to me knowing about this article. You see, I was watching a Doodletone stream recently when this happened.
I have to look this up. This seems like commentary material. What is this title? Please tell me it's a bait and switch. So it starts out, trans men are men. Cool, right?
Okay.
In parentheses, but trans women are not women. And I'm like...
Ah, so turf shit.
Yep, it's got some nice turfy trans misogyny.
I, wanting to know more, decided to just ask if I could have a link to the article.
Everyone requests that you...
philosopher.
Everyone requests that you send that to him.
No problem.
Because of course he does. Because of course he does.
Anyway, I did get a link to the article and found out it was written by someone named Holly Lawford Smith, a political philosopher. The article begins by saying the following. As will be familiar to anyone who is likely to be reading this... Oh my god, first clause and already I have an issue. What do you mean is likely to be reading this? Do you just mean that everybody who reads this article is likely to already know this, or do you mean that most people who know this are reading this article? Obviously, I assume the first one, however the wording here is just kind of weird. Transsexualism, as it was understood in the past, has undergone a rapid rebranding as transgenderism. You know, one of those rapid rebrandings that began in 1965. Seriously, that's when the word transgender was coined. Isn't research a funny thing sometimes? Even giving the author the benefit of the doubt and assuming she's talking about when the word became mainstream as opposed to when it was first coined, that still began in the 1990s. Meanwhile, the term itself really only entered the mainstream in the 2010s or so. So my point is, this wasn't a rapid rebranding, this is just kind of what it was always called, or at least had been called for a very long time, again, going back to when this concept first entered the mainstream view, gathering a whole lot of new recruits along the way. Again, weird wording here. What do you mean by recruits? Are you talking ideological supporters? Are you talking a rise in transgender people? I'm not even saying either of those are necessarily wrong, I'm just saying you're being unclear here. The aim of public health officials and policymakers today is to depathologize transgenderism. Really? Which ones? Are you going to give us any examples or names regarding who it is you're actually talking about? which means finding a way to take transgender people's claims at face value rather than seeing them as a symptom of a mental or physical disorder. This all fits in very well with the popular idea that we should defer to marginalized people's knowledge claims. A knowledge claim is a statement that the person who says it believes to be true but is still up for debate. So we're being told to defer to the claims of people that are up for debate? That doesn't make any sense in the slightest, because their situated experiences with discrimination and disadvantage are likely to mean that they know things that it would be difficult or even impossible for people lacking those experiences to come to know.
Since I joined these men, I have seen shit that'll turn you white.
This is roughly how we've ended up in 2020 in the position of believing that an adult human male's claim that he feels like a woman is sufficient grounds for believing that he is, in fact, a woman, and so endorsing the trans activist slogan, "Trans women are women." If we resist his claims, we must think he is either deluded or that he is deceiving us, according to transgender philosopher Tala Mae Betcher. But many trans people are evidently perfectly sincere. So not setting out to deceive, and if we're to avoid pathologizing, it's also unpalatable to settle for the deluded option. Actually, it would just be incorrect. How palatable it is has no effect on that. Obviously, if you want to depathologize something, you can't assume it only exists because of delusion. Again, it's not unpalatable, it's just incorrect. This pushes us into finding a way to accept the adult human male's claim that "I feel like a woman" as being true. If he is neither deluded nor being deceitful, then his claim can be false in only two ways. 1. He is mistaken about how he feels. 2. He is mistaken about what being a woman feels like. I agree with Betchard that it would be pretty objectionable to presume to tell another person how she feels. So here I will pursue the second option. I will argue that because males are highly unlikely to know what being a woman is like, their claim to feel like a woman is likely to lack justification. I can't help but notice the use of the word likely here. So, are you saying that sometimes it is true? Well, if so, first off, that completely runs, which says trans women are not women, not the vast majority of trans women aren't women. But second off, what criteria exactly would you judge validity by? And for that matter, how would you practically apply it to the real world? And so should not be presumed true. Again, it shouldn't be presumed to be true, so it can be true, we just shouldn't take it as true right out of the gate. But then the rest of this article quite literally argues that it can't be true. This might not matter so much if there was nothing at stake, perhaps enough that a male wants to be a woman, regardless of whether his claim to be like women is true, but women's political interests are at stake, so it does matter. So trans women are not, and should not be accepted as, women. Oh, never mind, I guess we're going back to absolutes. So what was the point of adding the qualifiers before if you're just going to drop them immediately within the same paragraph? Both of these arguments turn out to have unexpected implications for trans men, because neither argument goes through for trans men. We have some reason to both believe trans men's claims to feel like men, and to be men on the basis of that belief, and to accept trans men as men. In the last part of the piece, I discuss a likely objection to this asymmetric endorsement of the claim that trans people are what they identify as. I wish to point out those were just the first 2 paragraphs of the article, and already you're going to see several issues. The biggest one being this thing is incredibly overwritten. And as I've already pointed out, this has led to multiple examples of the author just shoving in words all willy-nilly without actually understanding what they mean or how they would affect the communication of the idea being presented. This also means obvious points in the article are dragged out beyond belief. For example, the article spends 3 paragraphs emphasizing how little female representation there is in various forms of media. Now, this is important to the overall point, so I won't call it irrelevant. However, it is still more time than required. Take this specific paragraph as an example. What about literature? In Bias, She Wrote, Rosie Cinema looks at the gender balance of the New York Times bestseller list. For the list itself, it was pretty balanced. In 2001, it actually got up to 50%, and has been anything between 43% and 49% since then. But if we look at the top authors by decade, ranked by number of books on the list, there are only 3 women in the top 10 list, and the genre for 2 of them is romance. For the men, it varied between adventure, suspense, spy, politics, and mystery. In the romance genre, women have outnumbered men as writers since the 1960s, being more than 80% of the writers since the 1980s. Almost every other genre fiction category is male-dominated, the exceptions being literary fiction, which has been roughly balanced since 2000. According to wordcounter.net, this paragraph is 137 words. Let's see how much of that we can cut without actually losing any information. First off, in the actual article, the paragraph ends with a footnote with a link to the piece being sourced in the bibliography. So there's no point in including as much information about the original article as she did. For that matter, there's also no point in pointing out that the list itself is fairly balanced, given the entire point is the top authors are not balanced. So we can cut out any reference to that as well. For that matter, pointing out that women have been more than 80% of romance authors since the 1980s, I would argue is also superfluous, given you just said they've been the majority, and that was the only reason you mentioned the genre in the first place. For that matter, what's the point in including romance and literary fiction in separate sentences? I get romance is considered genre fiction, but it would just flow so much better if you listed the 2 examples together. And with that alone, while barely trying, I have made a paragraph that is 50 words shorter than the one the author wrote, but conveys the same important information. But okay, enough about the weird structure of this article. Let's actually get into the argument, which is more or less a logic giant quotes chain, which breaks down in the following way. 1. Our society as a whole puts more emphasis on the stories and experiences of men over women. 2. Because of this, the average man is going to have a much clearer understanding of the male story as opposed to the female story. You're likely to notice this argument has already switched individualized statements with collectivized ones. For that matter, it's important to note that this absolutist statement doesn't actually play out, even just working off of the logic presented in the article itself. I've already mentioned how the main piece of evidence for this is the fact that most stories are told by men. However, there are 2 issues with using that to justify the claim that nobody who's assigned male at birth can understand what it means to be a woman, whatever the fuck that would mean. The first one being, the article itself directly acknowledges that there are men who understand women at least well enough to write them in novels, saying, author Eli Gottabil admits men writing women take, quote, a hubristic leap. This is not to say it can't be done. Norman Rush does it in On Mating, and apparently William Boyd does it in Basaville Beach. I'm sure there are other examples. Again, doesn't the existence of such people inherently torpedo this argument, though? It wants to have it both ways. On one hand, the author wants to deal in absolutes. On the other, they want to avoid all the obvious issues that would result from doing so. The second issue results from, again, trying to individualize an inherently collective statement. Just because most works of literature, for example, are written by people who are men, that doesn't mean that an assigned male at birth person can't only read ones written by women, can it? What if this hypothetical AMAB person starts reading these books written by women and starts to relate to them, much more so than they've related to the books by their supposedly fellow men? Would such a claim then become justified? The article doesn't answer it because it doesn't even consider that a possibility. 3. Because of this ignorance, I guess nobody who's assigned male at birth can be transgender. Of course, this argument has one major flaw. To quote my friend Hester, the fundamental and repeated error in her argument is that it presupposes a priori that there is a single objective womanhood inherent and exclusive to cis women that is denied to trans women, rather than a subjective and contextual womanhood that one participates in, or even an inherent womanhood shared by trans women and cis women. Basically, the article has defined womanhood in such a way for it to make its argument without any proper justification for doing so. This is not something the article ever elaborates on or explains why this has to be the case. It's just assumed, with the article inherently demanding you accept that premise in order for the arguments to hold water. I'm not even inherently saying that's wrong, although I do personally believe it to be. With that said, I am saying that if this is the case, the article gives us no reason to believe that, and instead just assumes we agree going in. Which, if you haven't figured it out yet, I don't. Mind you, all of this is made worse by the fact the article doesn't actually define what womanhood is outside of, I guess, that thing men can't understand. Anyway, so final thoughts. This article was stupid. It was word salad that didn't make an argument and didn't even really present its premise particularly well. Good night, and good luck.